Across the Great Lakes region, water systems are aging, and that means looming costs to maintain critical infrastructure. To prevent more water crises and keep our water safe, we'll all need to pay, but many households already find water unaffordable. As the nation embarks on historic infrastructure upgrades, the Great Lakes News Collaborative digs in to uncover water's true cost.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Krupinski. I'm the marketing director at Michigan Radio. I want to thank you for joining us this evening. If you're new to our Issues and Ale discussion series, these are conversations that we have at Michigan Radio designed to engage people in conversations about important issues facing us here in Michigan. So we invite you to sit back with an ale or whatever the beverage of your choice is and enjoy our discussion. As you saw from that video, obviously tonight's event is part of the series that Michigan Radio and the Great Lakes News Collaborative are doing on water's true cost. So the collaborative is a partnership between Michigan Radio, Bridge Michigan, Circle of Blue, and Great Lakes Now at Detroit Public TV. And all of that journalism is supported by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. So we thank them for their support. So you're going to be hearing reporters from all of those organizations tonight. And we're also streaming tonight's event on the various partner Facebook pages. So if you're watching on one of those Facebook pages tonight, besides Michigan Radio's, we welcome you and we're glad to have you here. We also want to thank Michigan Radio donors in the audience because your support helps make events like this possible as well. So we, of course, welcome your questions during tonight's event. You can submit those at any time during the event using the comment box wherever you're watching, and we will try to answer as many of those as we can. So our host tonight is Lester Graham. Lester is the senior reporter at Michigan Radio, and he is also the host of Michigan Radio's Environment Report. So here is Lester.
Yeah, senior reporter. I think it just means old these days. So welcome, everyone. I want to introduce our panelists. These people have become friends of mine over the last almost 2 years that we've been working together. First, Brett Walton from Circle of Blue. Hi, Brett.
Oh, let me unmute there. Hi, Lester. Good to be here.
And then I can't see our other guests. Steve, are they up here? There's Kelly. Kelly with Kelly House with Bridge, Michigan. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Natasha Blakely with Great Lakes Now at DPTV. How are you today?
Hi.
So we've been working on a lot of water stories over, like I said, almost 2 years. And we decided that we really needed to go in depth on a lot of different parts of that to make it make sense to everyone, connect the dots, if you will. And so this week we started rolling out a bunch of pieces, and I want to talk to first Brett about your piece because it kind of opened the scene for water's true cost. So lengthy report, a lot of detail, excellent reporting, by the way. And I'm just wondering, was there anything that surprised you as you were teasing apart all the data to find out what the real story was?
Yeah, what Michigan has here are two sides of a coin. There are the well-known failures and challenges for aging systems and declining populations and financial issues that are well documented and are certainly around and need to be dealt with. But there's also this burgeoning opportunity. I think I termed it cusp of renewal. There's a chance here that Michigan is putting together the pieces to be able to address these longstanding challenges. And so that was the hopeful part of the series, is that there's a lot of opportunity now and a lot of attention being put on water issues in the state and water infrastructure in particular, the status and quality of these basic connective systems, so that there's more going on than there has been before.
And we're going to dive into that a little further. Kelly, tell us about the piece you've been working on and what did you find?
Yeah, so my first piece published yesterday, and it was focused specifically, on, as Brett noted earlier, he sort of set the stage with this statewide issue. And one thing I kept hearing, we see so many examples of the disastrous consequences in mainly majority Black, declining population, urban parts of our state. And from talking with folks, I was hearing more and more about this issue coming to the suburbs, coming to vacation towns. So my story was really focused on communities in our state that, not for lack of ability, but maybe for lack of will, have allowed their infrastructure to decline to pretty decrepit conditions. So one of the places I focused on in that story was South Haven, which probably the folks on this call know is an upper middle class vacation community. It has been that way for a long time. It is not like Benton Harbor, 30 miles, 30 minutes south. It is a place where there's relative financial stability. And what I heard there from local public officials who were showing, literally a crucial piece of water infrastructure that was crumbling 1,000-pound boulders off of this standpipe that could fail at any moment. They basically said, this is a result of us for decades deciding that we would not set water rates appropriately to maintain the infrastructure. The communities are now being forced to catch up. And so that, I think, is evident in the story too. You're seeing, and Brett's story also referenced this at a statewide level, water rates rising pretty rapidly because we are now, today's ratepayers are making up for yesterday's ratepayers having water costs that were lower than the actual cost of delivery.
Yeah, we definitely want to talk about that a little bit. Nat, I don't think you can talk about Michigan and water infrastructure without thinking about Flint. And you took a look back and a look forward at Flint. Tell us what you found briefly.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people are really familiar with, at least the bare bones of the story with Flint and the water crisis. But, for all of that, I think that maybe not everybody realizes how many years ago sort of the situation had been building up, and how it's actually something that a lot of cities in Michigan, but also just around the country, are dealing with in terms of similar situation. It just didn't implode in the way that it did in Flint or gain that sort of media attention. Like there was a study that I did reference in the piece from the Government Accountability Office that looked at 10 different cities, all facing like similar problems where they had that declining population of poorer and poorer people, post-industrial boom, and they were not able to keep up with paying for the maintenance costs or the repairs, and it just sort of it feels like it makes sense. It's what happens when you have a really large infrastructure system and the population gets smaller and smaller, and they just can't support what they have.
And I've been looking at rural areas, small towns. I grew up in a small town, grew up on a farm near a small town, so that's an interest of mine. And I went to Akron, Michigan, which is about 20 miles east of Bay City. They've got a town that started out, well, in the 1980s, had a population of something like 538, if I recall correctly. And today it's like 349. So they've lost quite a substantial amount of the population, but they still have to pay for this infrastructure, much like Flint and Detroit and many other cities that have seen a lot of people leave the city. They've got a system that was put in the late 1950s. And as the one-person Department of Public Works told me, it's 98% the same system. They've only done a few replacements when a fire hydrant might go faulty, or they have a water main break and need to replace a small section. Otherwise, it's exactly the same thing. And the really key part of that was their water tower. You're supposed to have like a day and a half supply for a city. They've got less than a day's supply for their city and their water tower because it's just not big enough. So that's a little introduction about some of the stuff we've done so far. I want to take a break. This is Issues and Ale. So I always bring an ale here, and it's always a Michigan ale. And this one is new to me. It's from a group called Triple Root in Holland. They started out in Zealand. So I'm going to be drinking that. Cheers to all of you. What'd you guys bring?
I also have a Holland-based New Holland Brewing, Light Point, functional white ale. It's pretty good.
Nice.
I'm not nearly so fun. I don't like to drink.
That's
But a tea.
good.
Yeah, a really nice. It's an expensive tea though, $36 for I think a few grams. So, but
That's
I
higher.
like my expensive
That's more
teas.
costly than a beer.
Yeah.
Brett, did you find a good Michigan ale?
Well, I guess we should let the viewers and listeners know that I am the outlier in this group here. I am not in Michigan. I live in Seattle. And I did go to the local bottle shop to try and find a Michigan beer, but they were out. They usually carry Jolly Pumpkin. So I have something that rhymes with ale, not an ale. So I have a cocktail, a seasonally appropriate rhubarb Negroni.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well, you can drink anything you want, tea or a cocktail. We're all happy with that. I'm just glad you're here. I want to go back to this first story. Kelly was describing this crumbling standpipe that's holding the community's water. What kind of things did you all see that really illustrates just how bad things can get? Brett?
Yeah. So, I mean, the great thing with water systems is that they've been functional and delivered for so long and been they've done their job. Like, we only notice them when they break, and unfortunately they've been breaking more and more frequently. That's been one of the issues, is that everyone says this infrastructure is out of sight, out of mind. And infrastructure itself is kind of an off-putting word, kind of wonkish, engineering and technical. We used to call these things public works, and we really celebrated our water systems. We put big parks around them. We had fancy stone towers. The waterworks in Detroit was torn down, but there's the one still standing in Chicago. Fairmont Waterworks in Philadelphia. I mean, these were iconic places within the city because this was a huge deal to be able to have potable water at your tap. And so for the longest time, these things functioned well and were relatively cheap. And we saw, Kelly said that, one of the reasons that water rates were cheap was because we weren't paying to keep them up. And something I like to say when talking about all these things is that all of your assets become liabilities. And that's what we've seen in water systems here. So it's not just water systems, it's sidewalks or roads or light poles or your water treatment plant. All those great things have to be operated and maintained. And that's where the failure has been. It's easy to put something into the ground, to allocate some capital dollars, to have a bond allocation, and to build that thing. But it's in the maintenance, really, that the failure has shown itself. And so we see that in mundane ways and in catastrophic ways. So the catastrophic ways would be the cost cutting and the operational decisions in Flint that led to the lead pipe crisis. And then in the more mundane, but also disruptive ways of, say, a water main breaking at rush hour, that there was the one in Oakland County in November that closed schools for a day or two and flooded streets. So it's the combination of like the really catastrophic failures that are public health crises, and then the kind of day-to-day breaking and deterioration in quality of life, things that might make you late to an appointment or have to scramble to find childcare for your kids if schools are closed. So it's that water touches everything. So it's a combination of the mundane and the really catastrophic that we're seeing in the failure of these systems.
Kelly, this deteriorating standpipe, how did they explain that? I mean, it's obvious. It's not underground. It's visible to anyone who cares to look. Oh, she's frozen. Okay. Well, Natasha, I'll go to you then. We know some of the disaster stories in Flint, but what about the regular, the structure itself, the underground structure, the infrastructure? Are there still telltale signs that, hey, we got a real problem here? We might have fixed the lead pipe issue. We might have good water coming from Detroit now, but we still have other problems.
Oh, definitely, because and this is the unfortunate thing, which is the problem wasn't solved, even if Flint has most of its lead pipes replaced, because Flint was a city that grew to be able to support nearly 200,000 people, and right now its population is about 80,000. and that hasn't changed, you know. So even if the government has come in, the state and the federal government intervened and brought funding and kind of made sure that the lead pipes eventually got replaced, it doesn't change the fact that the infrastructure itself wasn't changed, the size of it and the kind of population that supports. And, you know, you have all these other problems when it comes to water infrastructure. You know, it's not just lead pipes. There's, you know, bursting water mains, just normal wear and tear, getting overwhelmed from storms and sewage and all of that. So it all kind of comes into play, and none of that has been solved. Yet.
Yeah, one of the things, again, in the small town of Akron, it was not funny to the person it happened to, but it's a telling sign. Every once in a while, they'll have somebody come to the village board meeting really upset because they lost a load of laundry because a rusty valve loosened or let loose some of this rust, and it ended up in the pipes and ended up in their wash and ruined their clothes. It's a small thing, right? But when you're just used to turning on the tap and clean, fresh water comes out, that's what you expect. That's what it's always been. And then suddenly it's not always there like that. That's a real shock. Kelly, I was asking with this standpipe that you were at, I mean, it's there for everyone to see. It's not a hidden infrastructure under the ground. What did they say about why they let it go that long when it was clearly a problem?
Well, first of all, apologies. This is an ill-timed moment for me to have unreliable internet, so I hope I'm not cutting out. But what they said in South Haven basically was, at the time, local politicians, you know, the standpipe was flagged for a needed replacement 20 years ago. And at the time, local politicians were in charge of rate setting and deciding how to generate revenue for the water system. They did not want to make the needed investment, essentially. So they ultimately decided to put this little metal roof on the standpipe, hoping that would buy some time. Rates did not keep a pace with inflation. Fast forward 18 years later, and the water system, you know, underwent a financial audit that revealed you are still not, you know, generating enough rate revenue to maintain your system. So that finally, just a month ago, led to a rate increase that will, over the next 3 years, replace that standpipe. But meanwhile, they have 25 years worth of work that they are now having to stretch out over 40 years. So that progress on the standpipe, that's not really getting them, you know, ahead. It's dealing with a problem that should have been dealt with 20 years ago. And in dealing with that problem, they're now pushing other problems out to the future.
Brett,
and I think that's a common story, you know.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Brett, the state agencies, the regulators have been telling these many of the cities, except for the very smallest cities, hey, you need to take stock of what you've got. Tell us a little bit about that and why that's happening and what that might mean.
Yeah, so the very unsexy term for this is asset management. And water is a wonky topic to begin with, but asset management is like the wonkiest niche you can have within that topic. But basically what it means is that the state is having these asset management councils that are going to utilities and saying, we want to see your plans for how you're going to catalog your assets, your pipes and your treatment plant works. But mostly they're looking at pipe condition from the state asset side, looking at, you know, cataloging these things and planning out which ones need the most attention, a replacement schedule, basically going through what you have and prioritizing the work you need to do. The goal here is to make it cheaper to operate these systems in the long run so that you are planning your expenditures and you're not just reacting to whatever the crisis of the day is. It's more expensive to have a water main break and all of a sudden you have to tear up the roadway and find funds to patch the roads and dig around for all these pots of money than planning out when you want to do these types of repairs. So that's the goal of the Asset Management Council, and they're doing or gaining plans from a third of utilities over the next 3 years, 1/3 each year. And so it's a start, and it's one of those promising things where, if they get the data in, and so that's part of the difficulty, is getting all this data, which might be on paper records, not in a GIS database where you can easily manage it and compare it to other systems. But once you get all that in, it takes a lot of legwork to do that. But then the hope is going forward the next few decades, it'll be a cost savings for these systems.
So we've touched on this a few times, each of you has, and that is, we've known this problem's been around for a long time. City councils may not have asset management plans before them, but they've had public works people coming to them saying, we need to do this. We need to raise rates in order to keep up this system. And the local officials have failed time and time again to heed that warning. Why? I mean, why wouldn't they take that more seriously? Kelly, let's start with you.
I think, one, the calculus, it needs to be acknowledged, is very different in an impoverished community than a more well-off community. So I think, you saw in Benton Harbor, they have had major rate increases recently. And what that led to is more people not paying their bills, not necessarily more water for the system. So I think for those communities where you have a lot of low-income folks and a threshold to how much they can pay, it's a different calculus. For a lot of communities that have more resources, it's not politically popular to raise rates, even if possibly your residents can afford to. And in many systems, it's local politicians, it's the local, bartender or, librarian or whoever's on city council that's making these decisions. It's not necessarily an expert in water system financing. And these are time-limited political positions. One expert told me, basically, it is not politically expedient to do the right thing long-term. So there is every incentive to drive these systems into the ground and hope that the crisis happens on the next guy's watch. So I would say that is consistently a main driver that's pointed to by experts.
Flint is one of those impoverished communities, and they've been putting off a lot of this cost because they've been putting off a lot of costs for everything in Flint. Just keeping up the fire department, the police department, all of that has taken a hit. So what is the plan now for Flint? They've got to come up with this asset management plan, take stock. They've had some money invested in their system simply because, the judge said, you're going to make sure that they have some money to fix these things that the state is responsible for causing. What's their state now?
Unfortunately, as of what I was seeing from their current budget projections for the upcoming years, there's another projected deficit that's coming in Flint. So it's not a problem that's been solved. It's exactly like you said. There was money injected to deal with a specific issue because it was the issue that was most at the forefront. It was an issue that needed to be dealt with in that moment right away, and they did handle it. But that kind of seems to be what seems to be happening for all of it. When it comes due, when it becomes a problem that you can't ignore anymore, when there's enough public pressure that you have to deal with the problem, when it's an active crisis where people cannot drink their own water coming from their pipes, that's when they step in and solve it. Not because they necessarily don't want to, but there just isn't the money, and there isn't anything there yet to fix that problem itself.
One of my theories about government in general is that government's reactive, not proactive, and that would make the difference in a lot of cases. I'm sorry, Kelly, were you starting to say something, or?
Oh yeah, I was just going to piggyback off something that Matt just said, which is think
Oh, we're losing
an
you again.
important factor for places like
Kelly, we're losing you completely. I'm going to go ahead and move on to another question, and maybe you can work with Steve to work that out. So almost every municipality that I've talked to has indicated part of their problem is they've lost revenue sharing. The state's not giving as much of the state sales tax to them as it once was. The Headley Amendment, which we had this huge recession, the Great Recession, and home values went down a lot. So did assessments. But the Headley Amendment and Prop A work together and end up, you can't raise taxes as fast. Your house may increase in value a lot more, but it's limited to 5% or the rate of inflation, whichever is lower because of Prop A. So there are some tax limitations for local governments. They're not getting as much as they used to get. In fact, I think it's this past year was $800 million statewide, less in revenue sharing money for the municipalities. And that's caused part of the problem. The question in my mind, and nobody really could answer this, is if these cities would have had this money, if they would have been fully funded to the level that they used to be on revenue sharing, if there wasn't a Great Recession and they would have been able to keep property taxes at the same basic level, would they have fixed the problem? Would they have dealt with this ongoing maintenance issue? Anybody want to grab that one?
So earlier, Kelly had been trying to say that suburbanization continues to rob residents from places like Flint, which just compounds the problem that it was already having, losing people, not being able to pay for what they have, and the infrastructure deteriorates, and then more people leave. And I think that using that as a segue to talk about the suburbs and what Kelly wrote about in her piece, I don't know if it would. I don't think it would have been solved because nobody wants to pay that extra money. So even if there were the people there, and even if they had the money for that, it seemed like nobody wanted to move forward and pay for it anyway.
Kelly, are the wealthy suburbs facing the same kind of problems? Because some of them, losing some revenue sharing money might hurt, but it's not going to cripple them the way it might another town.
Yeah. Well, I think, it varies from town to town, how well a local community has decided to invest in its infrastructure. But by and large, in many of our suburbs or in many of our places that have newer infrastructure, that's the difference. It's that the infrastructure is newer, so the bill has not come due yet in the way that it has with older infrastructure. So we do have communities where, it simply hasn't reached the moment where we're able to test whether or not they've adequately saved up for the future, because the future isn't here yet. But if you ask experts, the answer is often no. Those asset management plans are an attempt to head off, eventually learning the answer to that question because a crisis happens. But it's important to note that our state has really no regulatory power over water system finances. So they can require the plan, and they can gently cajole a system whose plan clearly shows they are not adequately investing in their system to change that. But they have no regulatory stick to come in and say, you must change that, until and unless that problem reaches the point of crisis. And of course, at that point, the crisis is already here. So I would point also to an absence of state regulation helping to not necessarily cause the problem, but it certainly doesn't create an avenue for it to be fixed in the absence of action by the local authorities who are in charge of rates.
Brett, if you talk to the average person, they'll say, look, I pay my water bill. All my neighbors pay their water bills. That should cover the costs. What's the problem? Why is this local government, why does it need to go to the state or get the federal government to, get more money? I've paid my bill.
Yeah, for water at the household level versus the community level is where we're looking at here. So you can have everyone pay your bill and do it on time in full, but still not have the revenue at a community level to be able to adequately address the problems. And so a lot of the problems here are just your basic size of a water system. The way we've designed these centralized systems is that it requires a lot of pipes to bring water to the household. And those underground assets are expensive to put in and maintain. So one of the estimates in Southeast Michigan from the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments is that for all of the pipes in that 7-county region to be brought up to fair or good condition in the next 20 years will require $3 billion a year just for the pipes to bring water. And so that's the stuff you don't see. It's underground, but it's, every street has a pipe basically underneath it. And so that's where the cost lies, is making sure these pipes are up to date and not breaking. And as Kelly said, communities have different levels of resources to address this problem. There are wealthier communities who can raise rates, who could afford to do all this. And then there's poor communities that, even if they wanted to, would not be able to afford the requirements, would not be able to afford the work that needs to be done. And so that's where some of the other potential cost saving things come into play. One which we haven't talked about yet, but Kelly did a story on, was consolidation, and these smaller towns working together, either direct connections or by sharing billing systems or sharing operators, just ways to unite all of these disparate systems into a fewer things that are easier to run.
And I think, go ahead, Lester.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, again, to go back to suburbanization, Michigan's population has remained pretty much the same for multiple decades. Over that time, people have moved further out into the farm fields, expanded our system of pipes, built new water treatment plants. So today, even though we have the same number of people roughly that we did decades ago, we have more pipes and treatment plants for the same number of people to pay to maintain. So, rates are going to need to be higher just by virtue of that. And consolidation comes into play because of that, but it also, can be difficult when you've had conscious efforts to secede from city water systems and a lot of bad blood, politically and racially and geographically, that need to be overcome, even if consolidation makes sense on paper.
We've been talking about how a lot of communities didn't raise their rates all along, and then they get caught in a bind because an emergency repair happens, and then the rates really have to go up. So let's talk about rates rising in an era where people are becoming increasingly concerned about water affordability. We've had, during COVID, shut off moratorium to make sure that people actually had water to deal with. Where's the balance here? Where do we find enough money in the bills to be paid, yet not put folks who are at the lower income level at risk of not having water at all?
Yeah, and I can take that one. I have a story up next week on affordability and how this affects households. And to go back to something we said before, this is a problem that has multiple expressions. So you have wealthier communities that can afford to subsidize some of their poorer customers. And then you have some communities where there are too many people who would need assistance for the community itself to be able to afford that. This is a case where you have utility managers saying, we need some outside help, some state or federal program to be able to assist low-income customers with their water bills, and so that we can do all the work we need to do to make sure the system is maintained and operated and runs functionally. We do have, for the first time, a federal water bill assistance program thanks to the pandemic, there was $1.1 billion over the last 2 years that were appropriated by Congress into this. And it just started this year, or I guess last year, 2021, sending money out. So it goes from Congress to states to utilities. It's a test run program. It's nowhere near the size of the federal energy assistance program called LIHEAP, which has been around for 4 decades. But this is a first attempt from the federal government to get involved in assisting low-income water customers with water bills. We'll see where that goes, if that program gets extended or expanded. But it's the sort of thing that utility leaders particularly want to see, so that they don't have to put all of that burden on their own rates and locally when they might not be able to do so.
We've been hearing politicians trumpet the stimulus money, this infrastructure bill money that's coming in. It's a substantial amount of money earmarked for water infrastructure, and people are excited about it, rightly so. But let's put this in perspective. We've got billions coming in. Is it even close to enough to fix the problem, Kelly?
No. I mean, that's, and I think that's true of water systems as well as roads and other priorities that are receiving some of these COVID dollars and infrastructure dollars. But, it has been repeatedly repeated by multiple task forces and expert panels for years that Michigan needs more consistent funding. And the infrastructure bill is a one-time thing. It can be spent over multiple years, but in 2016, the infrastructure task force for the state, I think, pointed to almost $1 billion annually that needed to be invested in water infrastructure. And that's for decades on end. So this is, on one hand, revolutionary in comparison to where we were, but also a drop in the bucket in comparison to where experts who have studied this issue say we need to be from a funding perspective.
Nat?
Yeah, and along that note, one of the things I put in my story was that the EPA's latest from 2018 survey of drinking water infrastructure needs, they put the number at actually pull it up so I get it right. 472.6 billion is needed to maintain and improve the drinking water infrastructure across the country. So not just Michigan, but across the country over the next 20 years. And that's an insane number, and even the recent infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that got passed, it put an amazing amount of money toward the problem. But 50 billion, that's, again, a huge amount of money, but it doesn't, that's a small chunk of what experts and analysts and everything have calculated is needed to actually help with the problem.
And just to add on to that, to maybe stating the obvious, but even if that were enough to bring our water systems back to shiny new status, the fundamental imbalance where we're not putting enough money in over time to then maintain that investment that's about to be made with all of this money exist. So there needs to be, if we are to maintain our infrastructure for the future, there needs to be something to address that long-term funding issue, whether it be through adjusting rates or through having a consistent source of state or federal funding that can go back into these systems over time in the form of maintenance, rather than allow things to get dire and then have a federal bailout. That boom and bust cycle is going to continue if we don't address that fundamental issue.
And on that note, things are, aside from like regular wear and tear being something that people need to account for, there's also climate change, which is, a huge factor in so many ways that people need to account for in how they design and build infrastructure, in the new stressors that the infrastructure has to deal with, and even account for, like, more and more places are starting to see toxic algal blooms as water's warm and everything, and that's something that water intake plants have to take into account. And that's a whole nother thing they have to account for, and increased storms and how that overwhelms the water systems. Like, all of that is also going to come into play and just add yet another factor and more cost to the whole situation.
The Clean Water Act is 50 years old, and prior to that, we had other big water bills come through. And there was a time when the federal government was pumping out a lot of money to help towns build drinking water plants, sewer systems, things like that. It peaked right around 1980. And then it started to fall off. We had a little spike during the Obama and that was administration, and that was the stimulus. And it's basically plateaued at that lower level prior to that stimulus money. Why have we had this disinvestment by federal government and by state government in infrastructure? I mean, there used to be so much civic pride when you built a courthouse, for example, or your state capitol. It was a grandiose deal. You were so proud when you installed a new water system, drinking water system in a village or a town. What happened? Did we just get blasé about all that? Brett?
We changed the way we fund infrastructure. So after the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, the federal government put a ton of money into building up-to-date modern sewage treatment plants. And so that was the big federal investment in water in the 70s and early 80s, as into making sure we didn't have sewage in the rivers, or as much sewage in the rivers. Yeah. And then in the Reagan administration, feeling that that problem they had a better handle on that problem than before, and hearing that some people didn't like all the rules that come with federal grants, they transitioned to a loan program. So instead of free money, now you got a low interest loan. And that's where we've been for clean water, sewage, wastewater since the mid 1980s, and for drinking water since 1996. And this is the program through which most of the federal money in the infrastructure bill will flow. It's called the state revolving funds. There'll be another story from the collaborative on this next week that goes into detail. But again, this is a low interest loan program. So the federal government never got out of funding water infrastructure, but it did move away from grants largely to a loan system, and put all the pressure then on state and local. So now 95% of the operations and capital expenses for water systems comes from state and local. And so that's where you see all the pressure now, is it's all on the local rates and the state payers.
I'm curious, Brett. I'm not well versed in sort of the triggers at the federal level, but I had one water system manager. I was asking, do we need more federal investment? And of course the answer was yes. But he also said that was a gift and it was our responsibility to maintain it once the feds paid to build it. And I'm curious, was there any, hindsight, of course, allows him to say that, but I'm wondering, at the time when those investments were made, was there any explicit acknowledgement that locals would then be, these are yours, you go forth and maintain it? Or was the expectation that federal investment would continue at that rate?
Yeah, the federal agencies don't fund O&M, operations and maintenance. It's more, here's the new thing, we built the project, and now it's up to you. And state level also, one of the few states I know of that's looking at having a state fund to subsidize operations and maintenance for water utilities is California, where a case where you have lots of very poor rural water systems that can't do it on their own. 90% of the community would fall into the poverty rate. So that's a case where a state is stepping in with operations and maintenance, but largely it's, we build it and you take care of it now.
It's kind of like your Uncle Sam gives you a car, but you're expected to change the oil once in a while.
Right. I mean, it's
I want to tell all the viewers tonight that we want your comments and we want your questions. In fact, there's some lined up here. So We want to save a little bit of the storytelling for actually the stories that are coming up. So we don't want to reveal everything we're doing right now. So let's see if we can answer some of these questions. Elizabeth Briggs asks, in your reporting around the state, are you hearing much interest in communities in adding green infrastructure for sewers, I assume, or for stormwater, and considering nature-based solutions as part of their public works?
Lester, you've written on that quite a bit.
I have.
Yeah, I think that's your topic.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of cities that are looking at that. Just give you a couple of quick examples. The one I love is Grand Rapids because they're really getting serious about it. They're using, they're wanting to reduce their stormwater runoff. So they're limiting the number of parking lots. They're taking some parking lots out of the system. When they have parking on the sides of the streets, they're using porous concrete that allows the rain to go soak through and go to the ground under. They're doing a number of things there, and other cities are doing that too. Detroit has been looking at bioswales and different things that they can do. And Detroit only recently started having these big flooding problems. This is not something historically that has been a problem in Detroit, but it is now because the climate system is changing. So there are cities that are looking at it. There are counties and some drain commissioners that are looking at it seriously. But I don't think you could say that it's been embraced widely. I think they're kind of waiting to see how that works out for everybody else, or they look at the price tag and think, maybe I can just buy a concrete pipe instead of go to all this trouble of making this system. And it's new to some engineers, and it's like anything. You want to stick with what you know because you can calculate it. This unknown organic project that you're talking about, I don't know if it's going to be able to handle the kind of capacity that we need. Let me go to another question here. This comes from Robert Last. As upgrades and repairs are made, are requirements being created for water loss and quality monitoring systems being mandated or encouraged? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I'm not aware of any new state level requirements around water loss. I don't know if anyone else here is, but obviously many of our older systems have a lot of water loss, and that's a financial problem for communities because you're generating water that you're then not selling. And I know that it's often raised in those inspections that Eagle does of water systems called sanitary surveys, where they will say, something to the effect of, you need to be worried about your water loss. You need to be paying attention to this. Water quality monitoring, there have been many new regulations and standards put in place since the PFAS crisis. So I don't know the specific language, but I would assume that systems are having to monitor for that because they are having to make sure that it's under a certain threshold. So there is quality monitoring going on for those pollutants that are deemed, problematic and worth keeping an eye out for.
We're also on the cusp of a trend of using sensors more frequently. Right now you're relying on going to a tap, taking a water sample, taking it to a lab and having it tested. But there are different ways you can do that. There are some systems that have dead end loops that became a problem in Flint, and that may have been the cause of Legionnaire's breakout. There are a lot of things that water companies and sewer companies are looking at, but we're really in the early stages of having, a kind of detailed monitoring system that might get to what he's talking about. Nat, did you have anything you wanted to say about that question?
Regarding the monitoring thing, what I did think was kind of interesting was the Great Lakes Water Authority, which sort of handles like a chunk of southeast Michigan, mainly around Detroit. They recently have been trying this new sort of like floating sensor they put in the Detroit River, focused on algal blooms and kind of sensing when that might end up being an issue to kind of preempt that for the water system. So But it, when we covered it, that was, I think, from this spring, and I think that it's still pretty new to them, and also in general. So I think that a lot of places are probably starting to try and experiment with this. Like, can we get ahead of this issue? Like, how can we get ahead of an assortment of issues when it comes to water quality and stuff like that. But I think this is something that in more recent decades people have started to pay attention to, and so now is when they're really trying to start thinking like, okay, can we get ahead of this rather than just deal with the consequences as they come. But because of that, it's still so new, so I don't know how many places have really been able to implement anything.
I just watched the documentary, a preview of a documentary that's coming out soon. And it's about Toledo and the algal blooms there, and the number of sensors that they're putting around in what they call the raw water, the source water, the lake, and its intake. And a lot of other cities are watching that to see exactly how they're managing it and what other ways those kinds of isolated sensors can be used to deal with all the other cities' water problems. We're getting a couple of more questions about, gray infrastructure versus green infrastructure and things like that. I want to add one story that I thought was really interesting, and I don't remember the numbers exactly, but when the Midland dams broke, there was a huge amount of water and cities were flooded. And one of the things that happened was at the Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge, they had just put into this big, huge wetland, which at that time of year was pretty empty. So they opened up the gates to the surrounding rivers and let that floodwater come in to this huge area. And they estimate that actually may have saved some cities downriver from worse flooding, because such a huge amount of water was able to go in. Talk about green infrastructure. I mean, you want to have that kind of setup anyway to manage your wildlife for ducks and other waterfowl and so forth, but to use it in an emergency like that to help relieve it, that's pretty good thinking, I think. The Shiawassee Wildlife Refuge has been recognized for that, and it really helped a lot. And again, we're still getting more of these infrastructure. One point was made that we spend $750 billion on defense every year. Why can't we spend more on infrastructure? I think probably everybody's thought about that at one time or another. This is from Jim Nash. Green infrastructure is becoming more common across the state. There are efforts to make the standard best practices. We need some serious community buy-in, and my chat bubble is interfering with seeing that all the way. But let's talk about that just a little bit. I mean, with drinking water systems, there's not a lot of way to get around having big water treatment plants, or at least if it's a well, some kind of treatment there, and then pipes to get it to the homes. But with stormwater runoff, that's a different story. Are we getting serious on some of that and looking at it?
I don't know if I can answer that question, but I was smiling at Jim's comments because I had a conversation with him for this project. And of course, we're focused on drinking water, but stormwater repeatedly came up. And I think it'd be actually interesting to hear from Jim on whether or not we're getting serious about it, since he runs, helps run a water system. But what I do remember him saying was two things. One, stormwater is not eligible for as much of the state funding assistance that drinking water is eligible for. So it can be very hard to get outside resources for stormwater management. And then two, and I am sure I'm going to butcher this, but Michigan has had past court decisions and policy decisions that have limited local government's ability to collect stormwater management funds, which also, regardless of how serious you want to be about it, basically the financial mechanisms for accomplishing it can be more difficult. I'm wondering though, Lester, if maybe you know more about that, because I know that in your stories you did reference the decisions that sort of affected local property tax revenue and, the difference between sort of a service delivery versus an unallowable fee when it comes to stormwater.
Well, there's the thing on stormwater has changed a lot because people are beginning to realize we can't engineer our way out of this problem. We can't build big concrete reservoirs because climate change, they're basing all their decisions on past history, and climate change is messing up all their calculations. So that's not going to work. They're going to have to look at different ways to handle it. And there's some cities doing some, like I was talking about, Grand Rapids doing some really innovative things, but everybody's going to have to start thinking about this differently because we can't engineer our way out of it, so to speak, with concrete pipes. It's just not going to work. You're never going to get the pipes big enough. I know you guys know a guy named Peter Annan who wrote a book on, it's called On the Great Lakes. I forget the title of it. Brett, what's the title of Peter Annan's book? Do you remember?
Isn't it Great Lakes Water Wars?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I was talking to Peter before we started this series, and he was telling me, even though we know things are changing and things are changing rapidly, FEMA, for example, will give you the money to replace a blown out culvert, but it won't give you the money to build a bigger one. So you can replace what you had, which was inadequate, but you can't build something bigger with that money. And I thought that's just the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. We're intentionally being belligerent about change through bureaucracy. It's fascinating to me. Elizabeth Riggs makes the point that stormwater may be a downstream community's drinking water source. And trust me, along the Grand River, people really realize that. The big problem now is the larger cities like Lansing and Grand Rapids are taking it very seriously and cleaning up their act. But some of the rural communities don't feel like they're contributing that much. Well, there are a lot of rural communities along the Grand River before it gets to Grand Rapids. So they're thinking about that. They're realizing that even though they get their water somewhere else, that is a problem. Again, we're looking for your questions. I wanted to talk just a little bit. We talked a little bit about why the infrastructure money coming from the federal government is not going to do the trick, but what will it be able to do? What do you think, what kind of improvements can we see municipalities making in their systems?
One of the objectives of the federal infrastructure funds is to target disadvantaged communities. So 49% of the drinking water funds and 49% of the clean water funds are supposed to go to disadvantaged communities. So the poorest communities. The difficulty there will be making sure that those funds do get to them, because in the past, the drinking water revolving funds through which the federal money will flow, small communities have not had great time accessing those funds. And so there's a big push now to reach out to those communities to be able to help them through the application process. This is coming both from the state and from Michigan Municipal League Foundation and some of the consulting engineers, trying to get the technical resources to communities to be able to help them apply for funds, because funds just don't magically rain down dollars on these communities. There's a process through which they have to go through. And that will be the potential roadblock. And one of the ways that it could go awry is that we have this goal of getting money to the poorest places, but it might not reach them. And that's something to watch, because this is a process that's going to run out over 5 years. So we're just very early stages of this.
On that note, I think that, and again, like what you said, how well this will play out is still going to be a big question. But I believe that they also said that those funds, more of them would be given as grants and I think forgivable loans, because one of the things that was keeping, I think, a lot of communities from going for these loans is that, that they wouldn't be able to pay back the loans, even if they took the money. And so, that's another aspect of it where I think they're trying to make sure that that the communities will actually try and go for this money. But, will that happen? That's still a big question.
I want to make a point. Later, we're going to ask my guests here about live events that their organizations are holding. But since we mentioned Peter Ann and Natasha, you're going to be having a book discussion with Peter Ann. When's that happening?
Yeah, next Thursday, May 12th at 8 to 9 p.m. I believe it will be through the PBS Books and Great Lakes Now Facebook pages and Great Lakes Now YouTube. You'll be able to watch it live or watch the recording afterward. He'll be talking with Great Lakes Now's program director, Sandra Svoboda, about his book, Great Lakes Water Wars, and sort of how that, what that means when it comes to today's debates about drinking water and water infrastructure.
And Circle of Blue and Bridge, Michigan are going to be having a co-event. What do you guys want to tell me what that's all about?
Sure. That'll be May 11th. It's a virtual event over Zoom, so I can drop some info in the chat. But Brett and I will be co-hosting, and we're going to have guests from the Michigan Rural Water Association, the American Water Works Association in Michigan, and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, sort of dissecting how we got to this state with our water infrastructure and what our path forward could look like, and also what it means for individual people on the ground, which will also be a focus of one of Brett's future stories in the series.
Steve Krupinski, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. So I'm not sure I'm getting all the questions because usually there's a lot more at one of these events. So do you see something beyond what I see as far as questions are concerned? Usually when we have a crowd this big, it's just overwhelming.
You seeing questions about additional and new toxins entering water systems?
I did not see that one.
Increasing the cost of treatment of water?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, well, let's talk about that a little bit. PFAS has been and I should say at Michigan Radio, we say PFAS for PFAS, so it's not confused with PFOS, which is a particular member of the PFAS family. So you guys can go ahead and say PFOS if you want. I will be saying PFAS just to explain that. We've seen a lot of water systems have to tackle this. The one I visited and know about the most is Ann Arbor. Basically, they were lucky. They already had an activated charcoal filter system. They did have to, change that a little bit to make sure that they could handle PFAS. They have to change it out more often and things like that. What kind of problems are we seeing in cities that don't have a charcoal? I mean, they have to build onto their water plant to deal with PFAS. Is that a cost that's being borne by the local government, or is that something the state's helping with? Anybody know?
There's certainly state funds, but not for, as with everything, it's limited and not everyone can access it to the same degree. Definitely, it's an additional burden, a monitoring burden. And if communities have problems with it, they have to do things like install filtration or otherwise deal with it. And then on the other side of our water systems, our wastewater, many communities are starting to find it difficult to figure out how they offload the sludge that's a byproduct of treating our wastewater, because a lot of communities give or sell that to farmers, and farmers are increasingly hesitant to take it because it's a contamination liability. And many people on this call may remember a few months ago when a farm in Michigan, had to recall all of its beef because they had been fed on fodder that was grown with fertilizer from wastewater plants where there was a lot of PFAS, and it ultimately ended up in those cattle's flesh. So that's an added potential cost on the other end of our water system as well.
Yeah, you wonder how we went so long without recognizing this PFAS problem. It's amazing that we really don't know how bad it's been or how long it's been bad in many of our rivers. Which when you talk to the regulators, how many chemicals do you want them to test for? Because if they're requiring more and more tests, that's going to cost the local municipalities. And why test for 50,000 chemicals if you only know about 500 that are bad? It's a tough balancing act to figure out exactly how safe do you want to be. And the fact that the PFAS was not on their radar is a little surprising considering the problems it's been in other communities, but they just didn't put our manufacturing process, they didn't give it enough scrutiny to see how much of that was being used in the state.
On that note, I think it's kind of more of a problem of, like there's so much out there, like what you said, there are thousands of chemicals there. And this is really one of those like ignorance is bliss kind of cases where if you go looking for something, you're going to find it, which is why, Michigan and Wisconsin in particular, there's so many cases where they find PFAS in cities and in rivers and water sources because they're looking. So the moment you start looking, you're going to start finding all sorts of stuff. And that's a can of worms that I think a lot of people don't want to deal with or know that they're not prepared to or don't have the funding to deal with. Which sort of ties it back to our whole thing about there are a lot of costs and there will continue to be a lot of costs. So how will we deal with this issue?
Yeah, the small districts, like again back to Akron, Michigan, one of the complaints is since Flint, there's been a lot more tests required. Now, if you're a large community, that's an insignificant amount of money for your budget. But if you're a small community of 349 people and you've got to pay for these lab tests for your water regularly that you've never had to pay before, it's significant and it's a burden. It's a burden for a good reason, but it's still a burden. Hang on, I got new comments. Let me see what's going on here. Oh, it says the chat's hard to find.
Oh,
one thing we haven't.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
One thing we haven't talked about, Lester, is trust. And so we've talked a lot about rebuilding the physical infrastructure, the pipes and treatment plants and water towers and all of the hard things, all the concrete and steel items. But as we've seen in Flint and Detroit and some of the other places where people have been harmed by bad water, that rebuilding social trust and civic trust in the water itself and the water system more broadly is perhaps a much more difficult and longer challenge. And this is the main way people have contact with their local government is through their water system. And even if it's just discolored water, I don't know how many people I've heard from who say they don't drink the tap water, they drink bottled water. And that is an added burden, cost burden on them because bottled water is much more expensive than drinking water. So this is a more difficult than just an engineering thing. It's a social cohesion, social trust problem that communities will have to deal with even after new pipes are laid into the ground.
There was actually a really interesting AP report in January that looked at federal survey data and found that the number of adults nationally that say they don't drink tap water, it increased after Flint, the whole Flint incident, and this happened nationally. It doesn't matter that if people who lived in Flint or not in Flint, collectively there was an increased distrust of tap water, which I think just kind of illustrates what you're saying.
Yeah, it's interesting that bottled water is so popular. There was a lot of opposition to Nestle. Now another company owns it, but coming in, and yet there's a demand for bottled water like never before. And when you think about, you might have a half cent's worth of water in there that you're buying for $1.69. It's ridiculous, but people are willing to pay for that convenience or this perceived safety that you guys are talking about. I don't think you're going to get rid of plastic bottled water when there are these kinds of trust concerns and frankly, just the convenience of it. Steve, I'm not seeing a lot of other questions here. We're coming up on 15 after, which is what we just said we'd definitely be out by the time. So is there anything else you want to wrap up before we go?
Can I, if we're about
Certainly,
to go
yes. Yeah, you guys want a round of last word? Go ahead, Nat.
I just wanted to say, I mentioned the Peter Eden event that's happening next Thursday, but we also have, Great Lakes Now, we have a monthly show, and we're going to be producing 3 segments. Our whole May episode is going to be all about this project. So, if you're watching this watch party, I assume you like out there, viewers, if you actually like seeing people talking about the issues that we've been talking about here, that might be an interesting way to sort of get the reports that we've been doing. And we have a sneak peek watch party happening on Tuesday, May 24th, 7:30 p.m. on Great Lakes Now's Facebook or YouTube page live. We'll have Monica Lewis Patrick, who is a water rights activist in Detroit, Carl Kuhnke, who was the former CEO of Walkerton Clean Water Center in Ontario, who has decades of experience just navigating water policy and infrastructure. So that will be a really interesting conversation as well that people should stop by and check out.
So besides being on TV stations around the Great Lakes region, what's your website where we can find these stories from the Water's True Cost series?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. greatlakesnow.org for all of the stuff that we produce. You can get our episodes there for our show, but also all the digital content that we have and the stories. And then specifically for this project, greatlakesnow.org/waters-true-cost.
Brett, final words, and throw your web address in there too, please.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that assets become liabilities, and all these great things that we're going to be building in the next few years will have to be cared for and maintained. That water is never solved. We're looking for solutions to these things, but water requires constant maintenance and vigilance, and it always requires an eye on the problem.
Kelly House, you get the last word, and please give us your web address as well.
bridgemi.com. And I won't belabor the point, but ditto to what both Nat and Brett said, and really appreciate you having me on here.
Well, I want to thank everybody who watched tonight. It was really nice of all the partners to get together to do this and to also Facebook Live it. So we appreciate you taking the time to listening to this. We will have more stories coming out. We will have these live events we talked about earlier. So keep an eye on it. My address is michiganradio.org. If you go to our main page, you'll see a set of menus where you can go, drop down one of those menus, and you'll find Water's True Cost. And it will be all of our works. We're sharing all of our stories with each other and putting them out. So it'll be easy to find us at any of our websites. Thanks very much for joining us.
I'll be skewered here if I didn't mention circleblue.org for Circle Blues reporting.
Oh, circleofblue.org. Okay. Thanks, Brett. Glad you got it in there. All right, everyone. Thanks very much for joining me. I appreciate it. And looking forward to your next stories.
Thanks, Lester.
Thank you.